Good afternoon, everyone. I am Shelley Rogers, and I am with the web team here at Liberty Fund. It is our pleasure to have you join us today for the latest installment of From the Shelf with Curator Arnold Kling. Before I turn it over to Arnold and our panelists, Stephanie Slade and Tanner Greer, in about 30 minutes, I will open it up the conversation to you to ask questions to our panelists. Please feel free to either use the raise hand feature or the Q&A, and I will invite you to ask your question live. Arnold?
Okay, well, welcome everybody, and thanks Stephanie and Tanner for joining. Can I just start by asking each of you to introduce yourselves? Let's start with Stephanie.
Sure. I'm Stephanie Slade. I'm a senior editor at Reason Magazine, which is the libertarian magazine of free minds and free markets. And so I do a lot of writing, some editing, but a lot of writing about especially the intersection of religion and politics and what's going on with the conservative movement. That's kind of my focus.
Okay, Tanner.
My name is Tanner Greer. I kind of have two hats. I am the director for the Center for Strategic Translation, whose job is we basically find things that are written in Chinese that are interesting or strategic value, bring them into English so people over here can kind of have an understanding of what's going on in Beijing. And then I'm also a writer who's written for many magazines, a blog called The Scholar Stage. And like Stephanie, one of the things I often write about is new currents on the right. And there's a lot of relevance between that and I think the reading that we are discussing today.
Okay, great. So I think what interested me about Lasch is the way you can read it as anticipating a lot of the trends in the recent decade, certainly. So do you think his description of things is about right? Is it understate the divisions between the elites and normal people, or does it overstate them? So I'll start with Stephanie.
I think there's definitely a lot of truth in what Lasch writes. I mean, there are these themes that emerge again and again in his works, and especially in this work. And some of them I think are right on the money. So when we're talking about things like that our culture has become overly focused on self-esteem and acceptance and making sure no one ever feels left out or excluded or shameful. Whereas he argues, and I think he makes a really powerful point, that actually respecting people means holding them to high objective standards of excellence, right? And holding them accountable for their actions, as opposed to treating people like hapless victims who, don't have any agency. That's true respect. And so a culture that errs in the one direction loses sight of what actually respecting people and making them feel empowered is like, that's a true thing that he identified that I think is still with us today, maybe even worse today. Another thing he focuses a lot on is the sort of a technocratic approach that says experts know best, and we should all just sort of defer to our scientific betters who can manage, tell us how the world should run and how, life should go. And we should defer to our betters who are using scientific management to tell us how the world should be. These are themes that are real. I see them today. I think lots of people, especially in the conservative movement, continue to be frustrated and angry about the perception of these same sorts of themes. On the other hand, I do think that there are a lot of questions that remain unanswered with this book. For example, to the extent that you're blaming all these things on the elites, right, and the elites revolting against the masses, then you have to start with the question of what do we mean by elites here? And I found the whole time I was reading this book, I kept trying to come up with a workable definition of the elites that would accurately include the people who are the bad guys in his telling and exclude the people who aren't. And I was never able to do that. I mean, whether you're looking at people for an educational attainment or incomes, wealth levels, or people who work in the quote unquote knowledge economy versus the, working with your hands or something, in no case is there by none of these definitions do you end up with a group of people that are the bad guys, according to Lasch, and the rest of the people who are not. All of these, the masses and the elites are just too large in a society as large and diverse as ours. And so I'm not sure that the elites, blaming it on the elites has a lot of explanatory power, I guess, is how I would say it.
Okay, Tanner, what's your reaction?
Well, not that different from Stephanie's. I think this is a brilliant author in many ways who understood something significant about the American tradition that is often forgotten, especially by well, fusionist or libertarian types. But Christopher Lasch is a polemicist. And what that means is that he allows himself to be somewhat sloppy and paints in broad strokes that don't necessarily hold up to close scrutiny. This idea of the elites, which is in the title of the book and the main essay, is a right one to focus on. Like, he kind of slides, I think, a little bit lazily back and forth between what today people might call the professional managerial class, your upper 20%, and like the actual governing elites, or like, Silicon Valley elites who are like in charge of very large bureaucracies, companies, fortunes. And he slides back and forth between these two groups as if they're the same people. And clearly, I agree, Stephanie, they're not the same people. These are distinct groups, and one of them is probably more at fault for the things he wants to talk about than the others, and his willingness to lump them all together is one of his big weaknesses. The other weakness I think he has is if he's very correct on predicting some of the larger gaps that will emerge between this kind of professional managerial class and the American people as a whole, I think he does a pretty poor job of predicting what happens to that American people as a whole. One of the best examples of this is how he talks about how this middle America is the bastion of things like traditional religion and marriage and stable family formation. And actually, maybe when he wrote that book, it might have seemed to be true. But between then and now, there's been a collapse, fall out of the bottom. And it is this class of people that he despises who actually embody many of the lifestyle patterns that he thinks are healthier. And he does not predict this. And that's something important that he misses, and probably is worth investigating why he misses that.
Okay. Are both of you familiar with David Goodhart and the somewhere versus anywhere distinction? So he describes the anywhere as somebody who can live anywhere. So I would say, the people who are more comfortable in Prague than in Peoria. They can go anywhere in the world and feel comfortable as long as they're with people who are similar to them, versus somewheres who are much more tied to a location. And I think that distinction has gotten important. And I think it's, in some ways, maybe helps describe the elite mass distinction that maybe isn't so precise in Lasch's book. What do you think of the sort of somewhere, anywhere? And because if you're trying to explain something like the Trump phenomenon or the Brexit phenomenon, I think you can, and the sharp divisions between somewheres and anywheres, or elites and masses over that, it seems like there's something useful there. Any comment on that, Stephanie?
Yeah, I do think there's something to that. I think it's helpful to keep that distinction in mind as one of the currents in our society. But it makes me think of is, in many ways, our society has even since this book was written in the 90s till today, we've been moving ever more in the direction of more and more people, regular people, not elites, certainly not the 1% is what I'm talking about, but regular people who would be more and more classified or closer to what we talk about when he talks about the elites, or when you talk about the anywheres. So like, just the number of people who have a passport in America, the number of middle-class people who have a passport and have traveled internationally has increased dramatically over the last few decades, right? We are more mobile, we are more global, we are more cosmopolitan, we travel more, we are more, obviously, because of communications technologies, plugged into what's happening around the world. All of us, even the middle class, even the masses, right? Even people who are not in what would have back then been considered the professional managerial class today are part of the knowledge economy. Many people. I mean, there are still people who work with their hands, but there are lots of people who don't have college degrees or who don't have advanced degrees, who are middle class, who are regular people who are parts of the masses, who are plugged into the global economy in some way. They are part of the laptop class in some sense. You could be a person who's like a computer programmer who doesn't have a college degree, because clearly would be classified as a knowledge worker, right? Not, so what I'm saying is that the things that we want to use to describe the elites seem to be expanding to capture more and more of our society. More and more people would be able to be classified in that way, which maybe, I mean, you might say, well, yes, what we're seeing is that Lasch was correct and the elites culture is corrupting the society at large, right? It's capturing everybody, and we're all adopting these pathologies that he associates with the elites. And that's one argument. But another argument is just that, like, I think that, again, what seemed like it might have a lot of explanatory power in the 90s, it has less explanatory power when in the sort of modern, the 21st century economy and society in some ways.
Okay, Tanner, you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I'll push back a little bit on that framing. I mean, I think the problem with his book is that he encourages us to get caught up in this phrase elites. And if we put aside the word elite and instead just describe like a class, right? I don't think it really matters, because elite by definition has to be a very small, minuscule part of the population. Otherwise, it's not elite anymore. But if we're talking about 20 to 30% of the population, maybe 40%, depending on the definition you want to get, I think it's quite easy at that point to like basically take his analysis and say like, yes, there's a large and growing divide between the people in this group and everybody else. And this divide comes at the expense of the people who are not able to climb up into it. And importantly, success seems to be defined by your ability to climb up into this group. And that's what he's against. At the end of the day, he feels like there's a significant problem if we start defining like freedom and prosperity, not in terms of are we helping the broad base of American people, but are we defining in terms of is there like equal opportunity for people from different demographic groups to climb up into that select group of people who's able to benefit from globalization instead of have the headwinds of globalization come up against them.
Okay. All right, since we brought it up a little bit, the issue of the conservative movement in relation to this class divide or somewhere anywhere divide, it seems to me that what's emerged in the last at least 5 years has been this sort of national conservative movement, which is trying to appeal to I would describe it as anywheres trying to find a way to appeal to somewheres, and kind of take up their cause, especially on issues like immigration. So what do you make of that? Let's go, Stephanie.
Yeah, I mean, there's clearly in our politics today, especially on the right, a huge amount of resentment, and it is often couched in terms of the regular people being resentful toward the elites. So that's an example of the way in which this framing really was prescient and is definitely still with us, and if anything has been amplified since, I would say, 2015, when Donald Trump sort of entered the political scene. And one of the main policy areas in which that is apparent is on the immigration issue. So there is just a lot more hostility among conservatives toward immigration. And in some cases, you're now starting to hear, whereas the line used to always be for years and years, well, we have no problem with legal immigration, it's the illegal immigration that we're against. It's, what part of illegal immigration don't you understand? This is the kind of thing you would hear. But now I'm increasingly hearing from people on the right, intellectuals on the right, thought leaders, on the right, and in some cases, members of the public, we just need to stop all immigration because immigration is itself per se a problem. And there could be an economic component to this. We're worried about more people, more workers coming here, driving down wages for native-born Americans. There can be a cultural component. We're just worried about people who come from a different cultural background than us coming in and diluting in some way our culture, making it more like the countries they came from and less like what we think is great about America. And there can be a political, an explicitly political angle where sometimes you'll hear people like Tucker Carlson from Fox News, formerly of Fox News, say the Democrats are importing voters who are going to vote Democrat and help them win every election. Once, if they import enough immigrants, then they're going to win every election. And so with some combination of all these things, and we can argue about which of them is actually the driving factor or which one is more important, but some combination of all these things, I think, has made people, especially on the right of center in America in recent years, become increasingly hostile to the idea of allowing people to come to our country, and more a sort of like throw up the gates and keep them out, and we must preserve what we have now because it's all going to be lost. That is a real phenomenon. I don't want to deny it, and I don't want to suggest that there are no valid concerns underlying it. On the other hand, I do think that these things can be really overstated or exaggerated. I mean, the fear that people who come here are going to destroy our country is a powerful weapon in the hands of a demagogue, and it's been used that way a lot. And I may perhaps disagree with Tanner, I'm not sure, on the extent to which actually globalization is bad for most Americans, right? If we're talking about the 70 or 80% of people who are not members of the upper class, whether openness, trade, immigration, the kinds of things that were cosmopolitanism, whether these things are on net good or bad for our society as a whole, including the people, the average American, not just the people at the top. I think on net it's good for everyone, and so the fears associated with some of these things are misplaced or at the very least exaggerated often.
Yeah, I think the issue is even more powerful in Europe. Like Matt Goodwin talks about, how in the UK, in the US you have, Donald Trump sort of being an outlet, as it were, for this anti-immigration sentiment. In Europe, neither major political party is really an outlet for it. And so it's a real case where the elites just cannot connect with a mass anti-immigration sentiment. So anyway, Tanner, your thoughts on the sort of the conservative movement and the how it's trending relative to these class divides.
Well, I think in terms of the book, we've strayed quite far from, like, I think the way Lasch would identify what it means for globalization or any other force to benefit or not benefit the citizens of the United States. And I feel like a lot of the new right understands his critique, but actually is not very interested in providing a solution of the sort that he would endorse. We'll start with this. Like the big thing for the author of this book is a very specific conception of freedom, which he calls independence, right? Which is essentially this idea that self-governing communities have the ability to govern themselves, that men are able, in collection with other people that they personally know, to solve and handle their own affairs, and that they are not dependents on forces and powers that live far away. I happen to agree, Lasch, that this is a major problem. That human beings have this natural desire to have a sense of control and comedy at the human scale. And that the political and economic forces of not just the last 30 years, but the last 200 have pushed us away from that sort of human scale freedom and left us to mostly find enjoyment as consumers, as the ability to find, determine our own identities, to have more and more goods available to us. And if we're defining globalization as benefiting the average American, and that allows them to do that, allows them to eat oranges from Sumatra and, import goods from all over the world that would otherwise be very expensive, I think it's quite obvious that globalization is benefited in that way. But in as much as giant, supra-global companies and, well, maybe we could even say state organizations, or, you know, like things like the United Nations or what have you, the EU, remove the locus of decision and power from the local level to higher and higher levels, be it a corporate boardroom or, you know, an office in the CIA. That's the kind of thing that he cares about. And to some level, I think it is a thing that matters to individual Americans. And a lot of our malaise in our country comes from the fact that people don't feel like they have that control over their life anymore. And the new right recognizes all that. Their problem is that they actually are very uninterested in providing any real solution to this. They will say things like, oh, well, we need to be mean to the corporations because they're all woke, blah, 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 blah. But all that's doing is just concentrating more power in a federal government, which is just as far removed from the citizens as, you know, these corporations that they dislike. And so they don't actually, I think the new right understands and feels instinctually the sort of lack of freedom that a lot of people feel, even when they have a lot of ostensible freedoms granted to them. But their solutions to this is mostly just a sense of, well, we're going to use the power of the state to defeat our enemies. And that doesn't really solve the problem at all. It just kind of furthers the process that this book decries.
What do you think the solution that Lasch would embrace looks like? Because I felt like he didn't do a very good job of telling me, okay, you've identified a problem. What do you, and he also sort of, what I saw as an internal contradiction in this book is that he simultaneously is identifying the problem you're talking about and recognizing that bureaucratization, centralization, creating a welfare system that will just turn everybody into dependents, basically, this is a problem too. In fact, I think at one point he calls it a cure worse than the disease, right? So if big government is not the answer, then what do you think his answer would be? Or where would you like to see the new right go? Or
I think he honestly doesn't have one. And I think he admits that. He says in a different book that more or less the biggest problem with modern politics, or it's not a book, he wrote an essay for First Things in 1992, where he basically says the biggest problem with modern politics is that this isn't the question we're all trying to answer. Instead, we're talking about other stuff. It's I don't really have an answer to this, but this is what I want everybody to be trying to figure out an answer to. How do we help individuals feel like in a modern economy, after industrialization has happened, we've already kind of moved past the world of agrarian freeholders that he idealizes. How is it that we return to the distribution of power and agency that 19th century Americans had? And I don't really have a great answer to that question either. But I agree with Lasch that this is probably, in my mind, I think it's the most important question. And I think that libertarian critiques of the state often key in on how important of a question this is. They just tend to focus on one side of it.
Yes. So Stephanie, reason, of course, stands for free minds and free markets, which is sort of one view of liberty. But there's this notion of locus of control, and somehow there's, I think, a feeling that we've been talking about that Tanner's been hinting at, that that free minds and free markets are not sufficient for creating a sense of locus of control for people. So is there a problem with libertarian thinking on that issue?
Well, I'm a libertarian, but I'm also a fusionist. And what fusionism was all about, this is a philosophy that was associated with Frank Meyer, who was an editor at National Review in the 1950s and 60s. And his whole point was that liberty isn't enough, that our patrimony as Americans and as sort of members of the Western civilization is a combination of both liberty and virtue. And we must defend both liberty and virtue. And the virtue piece is very important, and it tends to go, I would agree, overlooked by many libertarians. But I think I think we must care about that. The thing that libertarians and fusionists can agree on, and I think many conservatives and hopefully some people on the left too should be able, I think, agree on, is that government's job is not to make us virtuous, right? Government has the awesome power to use coercive force against us to make us do its will. It should exist in order to protect our rights and freedoms and keep us free and secure. And then we should use that freedom to pursue virtue. that's, I think, the fusionist understanding of what a good society and a well, healthy, functioning society looks like, is government exists to protect our rights and liberties, and we use that freedom and that security to pursue the higher things in life. And so you do have to care about both, but I think where libertarians and everybody at Reason would agree with me on this, where we would say you go wrong is if you say, well, people aren't doing a very good job of being virtuous, so let's use the power of the state to make them be virtuous. Let's use the coercive power of the state to interfere, to try to coerce them, or even nudge them in ways. Using the state power to nudge people to try to make them be the way we think they should be, we would consider to be an abuse of power, or not the proper function of the state in a good society. And so, where I think people like me might get uncomfortable with somebody like Lasch or many on the new right is it seems as if they're identifying a problem, and I don't disagree that the critique is valid in many cases, but the only answer that they can think to offer, and that I can imagine anybody offering, is using the power of the state to force people to live the way they want them to live. And I can't get behind that. I just can't go there. So I would be very interested in talking about and thinking about spending more time and energy focusing on the question of how can we be more virtuous people? How can we build a more virtuous society? And that would, of course, involve cultural change, and it would involve civil society institution building. But I'm going to have a really hard, bright line when it comes to crossing over into using the power of the state to try to shape people into being how the people in power think they should be. That, to me, it's the bridge too far.
Tanner, do you have any thoughts on this issue of locus of control? And it seems like maybe several of us can recognize the loss of sense of locus of control, especially from a 200-year, 300-year vantage point in our society. And maybe this. There's a concern sort of in this book and in elsewhere that the elites are not sensitive enough to that it's, as long as we're giving people the goodies, we shouldn't be worried about the way they've, the sense in which people don't have the same locus of control as before. Anyway, do we have any ideas that work in a solution direction? Because I agree with Stephanie, the sort of, throwing more of the responsibility on government is almost an oxymoron if you're trying to improve people's sense of control in their lives. Anyway, so any thoughts on that whole word salad I just threw out?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not philosophically opposed to using government for the sake of imposing morality or whatever. It's just there's a lot of practical issues that roll up when you do it. In particular, I think so Stephanie talked about the need to inculcate virtue is important, right? And why I think it's important then to think about well, how does that happen? There's some new right folks who actually just believe that if you get the state to set what virtues will be, everyone just kind of follows. And I don't think that's a sufficient. I don't think it's empirically true. You can look at a country like Iran to see the limits and how that actually works in practice, or China, where I have lived, and it doesn't really work in practice. But number two, if you're forcing people, if you're using coercion to make people act virtuously, they're not really virtuous at all. And in as much as that was one of the central ideas of the old fusionist project, I mean, I agree wholeheartedly with that. Where I think I depart from the fusionists is that I don't think they take seriously enough the sort of experiences that people need to be in order to fully grow in virtue. The 19th century American claimed that Americans were by and large more virtuous than the rest of the world as they defined virtue because they were in charge of their own affairs. And that this practice of, through kind of a combination of running their own governments and doing lots of social organizations, de Tocquevillian, all that stuff, and running their own religious congregations, because they were masters of their own communities, it forced them to gain the civic virtues that one would need in order to do that. And that this process of taking responsibility for one's own life is a huge part of where virtue comes from. as opposed to having it being like imposed from above, where you just having to have, like, you line up with a pre-existing, set of laws or rules or regulations. And so, I mean, fusionists understand this when they talk about government. They talk about, this is why we can't just have people line up to like match whatever, government might have you do. But my belief is that I don't think, from the perspective of like the average individual, that, say, the kind of rules you have in an HR code are experienced any differently from laws with the force of the state. Or to put it like in a slightly different way, the current person existing in 21st century America, but you could say this was true in many ways for somebody in the 1930s even, is in many ways lives their life based off of decisions that people made in boardrooms far away, or due to algorithms.
Right.
I had the recent experience of trying to help somebody apply for a credit card. And in a past version, I mean, they weren't credit cards in the 1890s, but back then, if you wanted to get a loan or what have you, a lot of it would have turned like that. That person could have gone to the banker in person, and that banker could have personally said to them, here's why I will or will not give you this thing. Here's what you need to do to make it one way or the other. Today, you just press a button and the algorithm spits out, you're going to have this credit or you're not. This is a huge important part of this person's life. That really is, it's kind of under their control, but not in any way that they can understand, right? Not that they can consciously manipulate. They feel like they're a plaything of an algorithm. And this experience of feeling constrained by either like bureaucracies, systems, the sort of thing that a lot of intellectuals wrote about a lot in the 40s and 50s when a lot of these systems were very new, it isn't something that the fusionists, I think, have a proper answer to. And that's the weakness in that philosophy, and one of the reasons why I think it's unpopular now with a lot of the right, is because there's certain questions it hasn't yet like come up with an answer to, but it might in the future. And I look forward to seeing the fusionist who takes that problem very seriously.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you follow Brink Lindsay's Substack on the permanent problem, he's talking a lot about it. I'm not convinced he has, I mean, roughly speaking, his answer is sort of more localization. And I think of that as a kind of a trying to squeeze the toothpaste back into the tube kind of answer. It's just very hard for me to picture, are you going to have all of a sudden have the manufacturing of iPhones not go through 20 stages in 50 countries or whatever, and be done in the Peoria region? I just, I need to see a lot more to see whether something like that could work.
I think the most convincing vision of this that I've seen is Michael Lotus and James Bennett wrote a book around 2015-ish called America 3.0 that basically imagine this, that America 1.0 was this decentralized local agrarian thing. America 2.0 was this big government, big unions, big business. And then we're going to move into this kind of world where we'll have, everyone will have a 3D printer in their backyard. So you won't need to have, big manufacturing hubs, and we'll be able to decentralize our politics and our economy. Certainly the crypto people also kind of have this energy. But I'm not convinced anymore that I want that to be true, but I'm not convinced that's actually where the technological trends are heading. And so I can understand somebody who says, well, okay, we need to use all of our political power to try and halt these forces. But you might just, end up with the problems that, say, the Soviets had, where you halted the forces, but you created a worse monster in the process. It's a very difficult problem to solve without just complete degrowth or something like that.
And that's, I think, why some of these folks, the most extreme ones, end up going pretty far in the degrowth direction, and then they lose almost everybody, because ultimately most people, the masses, the average American, not just the elites, they do not want to live in that world where they don't have access to the conveniences and the abundance associated with our globalized market economy. So there's a whole section in this book by Lasch where he tries to make the case, he cites E.J. Dionne to do it, that in fact what people want, what Americans want are not that different after all, left, right, whatever. There's a coherent thing that we all want. And in fact, I think what he identifies is that people want everything, and they are not good at saying, I'm willing to make this trade-off in order to get to, trade off, give up some of this in order to get this other thing. We want the convenience and the abundance associated with, again, a modern global economy. And there are trade-offs. There are things that you don't have the personal relationship with the banker that you used to have, but the things we get in exchange are quite valuable to people, actually. And so nobody really wants to talk about the fact that there are these trade-offs that maybe are actually worth making. And so that's just a thing. I mean, yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah. And for a lot of people, what they see is things like the costs of immigration or globalization are very, very tangible. Anyone who feels like they lost their job because it got sent to China or it was taken over by an immigrant, that's the seen. What's the unseen is, the cost of living and standard of living gains. And some of those cost of living and standard of living gains may have accrued much more to other people than to you. And that certainly
well, I actually think globalization can be a little bit of a distraction from like what is the actual issue that like Lasch is responding to, and he falls in this trap himself. And certainly the new right like often does. Like I think that really, I mean, honestly, if you want to like look at books from 20 years ago that kind of predicted where we would be along the same way that Lasch predicts, I would look at kind of Charles Murray, who predicts that America is going to divide itself between two groups who are kind of cognitively sorted, the people who go to college and the people who don't. And there was other people at the time who also, made this prediction. And you could take out the global economy element of it. You could take out a lot of globalization. I don't think the situation would be that different. The economic forces reward a certain sort of personality traits, we call it intelligence and hard work or whatever, and access to those things that they didn't reward maybe the same level like 150 years ago, right? When everyone was a farmer and whatnot. And so this rise of this new class of people is partially dependent on like an economic and technological substrate that I think a lot of the new right folks don't really want to deal with, which is why like a lot of them, they want to, they basically say, oh, like our problem was that we, signed the Declaration of Independence and said life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness is the purpose of government. And that's where we went wrong, instead of saying it was virtue. Or we went wrong when we got rid of Catholicism, or we went wrong when we, got rid of the classical virtues and became Christians. They all have a different point, or they say we diverge.
Right. So Patrick Deneen says we got wrong when we followed John Locke,
Yes, right. Patrick Deneen says 76. And so, I mean, the problem with Patrick Deneen is an example of this. Well, he's a political philosopher. He thinks that like it's ideas that made the difference. Whereas I'm of the opinion that like, no, I agree with Lasch that like the critical transition point was late 19th century industrialization. And that once you industrialize, you create this world of giant internationally bound economic machines and state machines that regulate and manage them and fight each other using this industrial power. And that was the creation of economic and technological forces, not just the creation of like philosophical changes in people's minds. A lot of the philosophical changes like followed after this set of material changes. And so these new right people who think we can just like, roll back the clock if we tell people, oh, no, actually, the Declaration of Independence was wrong, folks. That doesn't actually get to the central problem, which is that we live in an industrialized world where there are giant corporations and there are giant governments and there are giant, Pentagon level bureaucracies. And that just saying that we need to have a politics of virtue doesn't get you back to the world where people feel like they have agency, or they feel better about where they are, and where there's not class divides that are attached to the people who can successfully use these bureaucracies and for their own way, and then the people who are kind of left behind by them.
So let me take you back to the 1990s, and the internet emerges, the World Wide Web emerges, and there was an optimism there that the central bureaucracies were going to fall. I mean, there was John Perry Barlow's, sort of manifesto. And I think, Reason magazine was kind of a big cheerleader in that era. And now I think there's this sense that the Borg has kind of taken over. It may not be that Facebook is a giant corporation with tens of thousands of people, but its algorithms are very powerful. So this may be an off-the-wall question for you, Stephanie, but is there a sense there of what went wrong, and can it be fixed, and can we get back to a vision of a more of a less sort of oppressive sense of the technology?
I mean, not that I can necessarily speak for all libertarians or everyone at Reason, obviously, but as a general matter, I just think the problem of the algorithms is a much smaller problem than the problems of famine and things that the technological innovations, the Industrial Revolution, and everything since then have solved. Like, these things have made our lives so much better in material ways, and that the material well-being gains have been so wide and are now reaching so many people in the world who were living in abject, utter poverty. Over time, things are getting so much better materially that to say, like, I feel like I've lost some of my agency because an algorithm determines whether I see pictures of this cat or that cat first when I log onto social media, just seems very small ball. I think it does.
First
I'm not saying
world
that it doesn't matter.
problems.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not saying that it's irrelevant, but like keeping a little bit of perspective here about what we have gained from these changes, as opposed to what then the trade-offs or the costs may be, I think is important. And that doesn't mean that you can't then say, okay, given that we've made these trade-offs, or we've had these costs associated with the gains, is there anything we can do to mitigate those costs? Can we think about how to build better social media, or to promote making different choices in our lives that will help us regain some sense of that locus of control, or whatever the case is, more community? I mean, I do worry a lot about community breakdown, the fact that, like, people may walk outside and not know their neighbors. They may never get to know their neighbors. And that's a thing that Lasch talks a lot about, is that neighborhoods have failed. I think that's true. And a guy named Seth Kaplan has a new book out where he talks about fragile neighborhoods. Our neighborhoods are not what they once were. I do worry about that. I will say, though, that as interesting as I found the chapter in the Lasch book on, he talks about third places, like going to a tavern or a coffee house, and how that was a really important social gathering place in these old-fashioned neighborhoods, and we've lost that because we spend all our time watching TV and surfing the internet. I'm not saying that's not true. I thought that was very interesting, but again, I found myself wondering, like, but how do I fit that into this idea that the elites are to blame for everything? I was not able to sort of paint a coherent picture where that thesis helped explain this thing that he was describing, which is, again, the sort of breakdown of communities or neighborhoods or whatever. I think we should care about those problems. We should want to solve them, but I do not think the answer is trading away the things that gave us these incredible material gains.
I suspect the last one to that question, like how are the elites responsible to this? Mostly on the theory of well, he has two answers. One is the theory of, like, neglect, that they don't see these things as problems because they're socially isolated from the consequences of them, and that, like, a better elite, or the elite that existed even in the early 20th century, who thought they should, like, be setting up charities and museums and all that sort of stuff, that elite would be trying to do things to solve this problem, whereas the current elite doesn't feel like it's necessary because they've climbed the meritocratic race and they don't have the sense of noblesse oblige. I don't speak French. Is that how we say that word?
Yeah.
That older elites of a past time would have had. I think that would be his first answer. I think his second answer would be that meritocracy in particular is very damaging to people who are not the winners of meritocracy, because it takes, it's basically the theory of brain drain, that you take people out of areas where they would be a big support to their community, and you put them concentrated in, you know, a very small set of places. Andrew Yang, before he was presidential candidate and stuff, wrote his whole job was to try and get people from Ivy Leagues to go out and to the rest of the country and build businesses and things that might revitalize those economies. He has an interesting statistic where he says, basically, if you look at the Ivy Leagues and then the other top 14 colleges other than the Ivy Leagues, it's approximately, I think 90% of them end up in one of 6 professions in one of 5 cities. Those cities being LA, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., Boston, and New York. And if those people had not made as much money, but had stayed in their local community, I mean, they might have been able to provide the leadership or the intellectual resources to help those places be more coherent and strong. And that a lot of people who like a lot of the collapse in marriage and things like that we now see, I think he would probably attribute to the fact that the people who were good at these things left those places and now lived off in sealed communities. And there's a lot of power to that explanation. But I think that on the question of like famine, I mean, you're obviously right at one level or another, right? Like it's kind of ridiculous when everyone's going around talking about how, you know, we wish we were Catholic integralist monks in the 13th century when, you know, we didn't have vaccines and so on and so forth.
Or merely returning to an agrarian society where everyone has to grow their own food. Like, I don't think people recognize how insane that suggestion actually is.
But at the same time, we can say, well, we live in the best world that we could live in because revealed preferences show that people have chosen to leave agrarian society or what have you to, you know, live their current, you know, life living off of the dole or whatnot. But there's like, I think that understates this set of problems we have. We can say, okay, the algorithm thing is we can say it's like a small thing that doesn't matter. And maybe it is. I use it as an example of a representative of a much broader class, a way of living. And when I talk to, you know, fusionists and say, look, if you want to beat the new right, like this is the chart you need to explain. I pull up a chart and it shows US suicide numbers vis-a-vis Japan over the last 30 years. The year before the pandemic, for the first time in probably history, American suicide rate was higher than the Japanese one. You know, it used to be 30, 40 years ago that anthropologists wrote about Japanese suicide rates as if like it was a immutable feature of their society, that they have this sort of thing, and that America and the West is so much different. And here we are, where we have, you know, a huge country that has things like, and the list is very well known. Everyone's on antidepressants. Everyone's killing themselves. There's a very large list of social ills. And you look at that and say, well, okay, we seem to be buying stuff. We have access to things we didn't have before. But if I had to look for like some kind of objective measure of happiness, I don't see it. And when one has to then explain, well, why does something like Trump happen? Well, I mean, surely this plays a part. Is there no responsibility the fusionists have for creating the situation that Trump and company were then able to exploit? What's your answer to that?
Well, wait, sorry, I'm going to actually cut that one off. It's a great question, but we have some audience people who are probably eager to ask questions. So maybe Shelley, you can.
Absolutely. We got John Alcorn. If you unmute, you are ready to go, sir.
I want to pick up on the discussion of anywheres and somewheres. There's a bit of a paradox about that because Americans travel more thanks to prosperity, but they migrate less. There's much less internal migration. And I'd like to ask you to address perhaps another social dichotomy, this one squarely centered on how the welfare state works, which might be an alternative in part to anywheres and somewheres. I have in mind a distinction that's new to me, but seems to have explanatory power. It's between people who want policies for so-called pre-distribution and people who want policies for redistribution. It turns out that some economists at NBER find that less educated Americans tend to want pre-distribution policies. Examples are federal jobs guarantee, higher minimum wage, protectionism, stronger unions, while more educated Americans favor redistribution, that is, taxes and transfers after the fact. And this educational gradient in policy preferences has been largely unchanged since the 1940s. But a lot of people who want pre-distribution policies as a way to preemptively change incomes now vote Republican. There's the aspect of the somewheres or the Trump that you've been getting at, whereas they used to vote for the Democratic Party. So these are two, it turns out that there's this fracture, this dichotomy in way people who want a welfare state think about whether it should be acting on the market before the fact or after the fact. The before the fact is a kind of agency, because you talked about regaining agency, trade unions, and so on. After the fact is, you know, tax and transfer. So I've spoken at length. I've put another set of concepts on the table. Anyone want to tackle it?
I think that the larger point is really important, and we ought to have, I mean, we should all be in favor of wanting people to succeed, you know, at every level of our society, everybody to succeed, people to have sort of equal opportunities, nobody to be sort of stuck. I mean, another thing that I was frustrated reading Lasch on is that he implied or comes out and says that we no longer have a society in which people are not fixed in their classes. I think that that's just crazy. I mean, there is social mobility, and there is an ability to have a good, work hard and have a good life in this country, regardless of where you begin. And, you know, you don't have to be part of the elites in order to have access to equal rights under law here and you know, basic dignity and all of that. Like there's something there that I couldn't quite understand what he was thinking of when he was writing it. But the point that I want to make is that, I think given the option of do we want people to be able to succeed on their own, to live productive, healthy lives, good lives, where they feel like they're contributing to society, they're self-reliant, they're able to support their families and be full participants in our civic life, and you know, members of a community, you know, contribute to their communities and all of that. Yeah, we should want that. And if we should want that should be our goal, as opposed to we should have an economy in which the rich become ever richer, but we then take from them and redistribute down to the people who down here who have no chance to actually live fulfilling lives under this modern globalized economy. You know, they've been left behind, is a phrase. And so we take from the rich and we give to the poor because that's the best they can hope for. That should not be the goal. We should not be thinking in those terms. We should always be thinking about, we want a society in which everybody can be full participants. And you know, there's always going to be some people who need assistance, whether that's government assistance or, you know, assistance through philanthropic, charitable, you know, private sector answers is another debate. There's always going to be some people who really are in need and need help. But we should want a world in which everybody has enough of enough opportunity to succeed in general and live dignified lives on their own, sort of without just having to be dependent on something else or somebody else. That should, of course, be the goal. There's I think a lot of disagreements and policy disagreements about whether, for example, any of the policies, John, that you just named, that you described as pre-distribution, would actually achieve that, and whether some of them would not, in fact, be making problems worse. I mean, protectionist policies that try to keep up.
My thought on those pre-distribution ideas is I picture a ladder where the people who are kind of, you know, a couple steps up from the bottom of the ladder are kicking down. And that's That's not going to be constructive. Kicking the people below them down. So,
Yeah.
can we get another question? Is there another one waiting, Shelley?
It looked like, oh, here we go. Richard Horns, if you unmute, you're ready to go, sir.
I was looking for a definition of democracy in the book. I didn't find a specific one. He gives a number of reflections about aspects of democracy. But I was really thinking that he might benefit from thinking more carefully or enunciating clearly a definition of democracy. This is partly because how do you solve a problem relating to democracy if you don't define what you're talking about? I look at democracy as a system of problem solving, and it's based on personal integrity, group discussion, and majority rule. Now, he talks about many of these features, but not explicitly, and his comments are very interesting. The personal integrity issue gets down to the values that he specifies, which people might talk about as, say, virtue, or how we function in we're dealing with others. It has to do with trust and honesty. Group discussion focuses on knowledge, information. And here I think his writings about the media are highly relevant. He talks about the distinction between Lippmann and Dewey. Lippmann pointing to the problems with the media that's essentially a function of the managerial class versus Dewey, who has a different view of how the media should function, meaning a way of facilitating debate. So I was disappointed because he didn't go into these issues in more detail, but I think his description of the media problem is relevant because that conditions a lot of what we talk about. I don't have a solution for that, but I'd like to hear your thoughts about his comments on the media. Specifically, do we have enough information in the media? Do we have enough facilitation of debate in the media?
Well, my first thought is that the media environment has changed, and probably for the worse. Maybe depends on your point of view, but as we know, the incentive is to, sort of highlight the evil of the other side, as opposed to have a nuance, create a nuanced, provide people with a nuanced view on things to facilitate discussion. Anyway, so if he thought that the media were not up to their job in 1994, I can't imagine, 30 years later, he would be at all optimistic. I don't know. Tanner, you want to take a shot, and then Stephanie?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a hard problem. Dewey and Lippmann were having that debate for the most part in the 1920s, when the idea of a national media was really like quite new. Lippmann basically he sources the beginning of the modern media complex in his book Public Opinion, which is great, by the way. If you've never read it, I strongly recommend it. It's I think probably the best book of political psychology written in America in the last century. And he more or less kind of packs into like World War I is where this modern version of the media starts. And they're kind of trying to deal with this question of when you have something like America going abroad to fight in World War I, like what is the job of the media really in that? Where does he has this, he imagines a Mrs. So-and-so in like South Dakota, and her opinion she has about German affairs to a country she's never been to, a place she's never seen, and she has some sense of like duty or moral obligation to know about these things as if that makes a difference. But of course, she has no ability to influence affairs there one way or the other. I think it's quite hard to roll back that sort of media complex where most people who inform media and call themselves informed citizens are actually just spectators, without also rolling back like the larger political and economic structures that it's attached to. There was a good political science book done a few years ago where they looked at the way that local voters thought about local candidates over the course of the 20th century. And early on in the 20th century, there was almost no relationship between the way people would vote when deciding their city councilor and when they would decide for president. It wasn't completely disconnected, but it was like not that disconnected. And the way that, you know, local newspapers would editorialize about it, people would read these local newspapers, would know a lot about what these local candidates are doing. Now, for the most part, the first thing people kind of ask is the question like, well, is this person like a Trumpist or an anti-Trumpist? They decide the local question on the basis of national things and national identities. And as long as this is how, I mean, you can say the media created this, in some ways they did, but in some ways the media is also downstream of a situation where, you know, the federal government takes over powers that local governments used to wield. If you want people to be informed citizens, I think, yeah, the free market would provide them with better information if that information was useful for them. Most people are not informed citizens because there's no use in their day-to-day lives for them to be so. But if they had to decide, you know, here's the exact tax rate I'm going to do for my school district or whatever, I think you would see something slightly different than we do now.
Stephanie, you have any thoughts?
No, I think that's a great point. I in my notes, I made a similar point about why are people less civically engaged now than they once were? Well, probably at least part of it is because government is so big and sprawling and far away and does so many things that it would be impossible to have an opinion on you know, like it would be irrational to try to keep up with and have an opinion on all of that for a normal person who's trying to live their lives. So there is some explanatory power in that as well. Just like government is so huge that people rationally check out and say, there's people who do this professionally and I'm just going to have to let them do it because I couldn't possibly keep up with all of this.
And if you did have an opinion and say it's a good one, I mean, what could you do about it? Right? Like, yeah. You know, if it's because of a change to the federal code, like what's your opinion? What's the odds that it's going to make a difference at that scale? And that's part of the wrap that we're in.
Yeah, you try to get a democratic approach to, like, should there be credit card interchange fees or something, you know, just some esoteric thing that matters to the people involved, to the companies involved, but you know, it's hard to tell what the impact is on individuals. All right, so thanks everyone, and Shelley, you want to wrap this up?
Yes. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Tanner. Great conversation today. Thank you to our audience for joining us. Please look for the next From the Shelf with Arnold Kling in our newsletter that drops on the first Monday of every month for EconLib. Again, thank you, everybody, and hope to see you guys again soon.
Okay. Thanks.